The horror within Bloodborne is not exactly a secret. The game wears its Lovecraftian and Gothic inspirations on its sleeve, and the word horrific seems profoundly inadequate at describing what's going on in Yharnam. But I think because of your position as Hunter, not as typical horror protagonist, not enough emphasis has been put on the parts of horror that this game executes perfectly. It does justice to its various inspirations, creates an unmatched visual aesthetic, and presents a multitude of top-tier enemy designs. Bloodborne has a masterful grasp on fear and various horror techniques, which today I want to try and highlight. We'll first be covering the Lovecraftian and Gothic influences on the game, then visual and aesthetic design. And this may not seem like a Christmas video, but that's all a matter of perspective, so remember to subscribe, join the Discord, and let's begin. In order to fully understand how this game perfects its horror, we need to understand its horrific influences. Without that baseline insight, it's impossible to comprehend the genre mastery Bloodborne executes. So let's start this video with a quick exploration of 3 horror novels I think are very significant when it comes to this game: Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Shadow over Innsmouth, though that one is a novella. I'm not going to give you full plot synopses because I'm not that desperate to pad out runtime, but I will point out what Bloodborne took from these writings, at least in my view. Let's first outline the fact that Gothic horror is an atmospheric type of horror, one which contemplates humanity and death, and one which is drenched in dread and framed by decaying set pieces. Frankenstein and Dracula were pioneers in this genre, and Bloodborne is a fantastic addition to the catalogue. It's an atmospheric experience, not one full of cheap jump scares and desperate attempts to induce adrenaline. It's slow and dreadful, and it certainly asks us many questions of humanity, our hubris being the main one. And of course, we have tons of beautiful Gothic set pieces. The city itself is magnificent, filled with black spires and looming clock towers, but we also have Cainhurst Castle, which is clearly inspired by vampirism and Dracula in particular. A core theme of this game is man's hubris and what happens when it goes unchecked. This is not an uncommon theme, but Frankenstein is certainly one of the most important novels to explore it. Victor Frankenstein, like Willem and Lawrence, is a man who discards morality and rationality in order to seek power and recognition. Conducting actions not because he should, but because he can. Willem and Lawrence seek ascension through study, experimentation, and blood, not because they should, but because they can. Through them, we see 2 generations of humanity's hubris, both with devastating consequences for everyone around them. That's also seen in Frankenstein. The consequences of man's hubris typically don't reflect back on himself, they reflect back on those around him and make innocent lives suffer. Bloodborne takes from this book the twisting of innocent flesh into something inhuman, the consequences of hubris and the Victorian setting it all occurs in. Dracula is more overtly supernatural, which is certainly a part of Bloodborne, though there's more emphasis on a sort of supernatural science as seen in Frankenstein. Man's hubris isn't profoundly explored here. I find it a much simpler novel focused on the struggle between good and evil. Dracula is most interesting when you delve into the subtext, which is where Bloodborne took its inspiration from, because within this subtext we find themes of xenophobia, being afraid of the other, and profound looks at femininity. The fact you're a foreigner within Yharnam is constantly pointed out to you. You're an invader, a plague carrier, someone who's not welcome. You are the other. The most obvious inspiration from Dracula comes from Cainhurst. It's such an obvious inspiration that you seriously can't miss it. As in Dracula, the protagonist is carried along by a supernatural carriage to a decaying and ominous castle, and inside they find a terrible supernatural truth. Bloodborne, though, is a lot more explicit with its exploration and commentary on women. The vampiric wives in the castle within Dracula have been rightfully explored as an aspect of Victorian sexual suppression, the fear of women with sexual autonomy, and we see that in Bloodborne through Annalise, who wishes to commune with Erden. Of course, it's not a one-to-one. There's plenty of differences between these pieces of media, but the inspirations are clear. Bloodborne is, unsurprisingly, more aware of what it's presenting to the audience than Dracula was, but it takes a lot from that novel and gives us a more modern interpretation of its various messages. Frankenstein is a much more biting and self-aware novel, and that is the same approach Bloodborne takes to its messaging. On to the Lovecraftian. This genre is built off H.P. Lovecraft's work. It looks at madness, fate, and humanity's desperate struggle to understand that which cannot be understood. A lot of Lovecraftian horror takes what the word human means and twists it, twists our bodies through eldritch body horror, and twists our minds through the warping of reality. Bloodborne takes a lot from this genre and Lovecraft's work, but The Shadow over Innsmouth is clearly the main source of inspiration for the DLC, so let's cover those specifics. The town of Innsmouth is a dying fishing town, known for the stench of fish and its strange inhabitants who walk peculiarly, much like the villager we meet at the start of the hamlet. Whilst the human sacrifice plotline is absent in Bloodborne, the people of the hamlet did worship and commune with an underwater deity, Kos, whilst the people of Innsmouth communed with the Deep Ones. Both of these groups begin transforming into fish-like creatures due to their relations with eldritch entities from the sea. It's very much so a bittersweet retelling of Innsmouth, where, like the protagonist, the orphan will return to the comforting ocean. The transformation of humans into something other is the main theme these two stories share, the transformation of an entire village into something separate from humanity. The twisting of the flesh into something other. Not only that, but the loss of your autonomy and flesh, as we see the Innsmouth protagonist losing himself to his lineage, and we see the hamlet villagers lose themselves to the Bergenworth hunters. Certainly not a plain old recreation, but there's obvious similarities between these stories. So those are a few direct inspirations for the game and their respective genres. I'll go further into certain techniques both Gothic and Lovecraftian horror employ as we move through the video, but without this initial understanding it would be difficult to fully understand why Bloodborne is so good at what it does and how it perfectly captures the essence of its genres. So with that knowledge in mind, let's move on to the main part of this video. I'll be covering the highlights of this game's horror design, and trying my best to explain why it's so effective. Let's start with the level design, then enemy and boss design. One of the main reasons Bloodborne's atmospheric horror is so effective is because Yharnam itself is sort of its own character. This towering Gothic masterpiece has its own things to say, it has its own voice separate from the characters we meet within. That, of course, is an aspect of Gothic horror. The grand set pieces are often characters of their own. We're introduced to the city through Yosofka's clinic, at least a part of it, and this opening section is excellent. I really enjoy the cutscene because it's a pretty frank presentation on what the game's about. Blood is an addiction, beasthood a tantalizing offering, a bloody hand outstretched that you feel you have to take because there's no other option. This whole scene is lurid, hazy and dreamlike. As the doctor says, it's like a bad dream. A core tenet of Gothic horror is making use of dreams, blurring the lines between reality and the mind, and as we can see from the start of the game, this is something Bloodborne excels in. The cutscene leaves you confused as a first-time player, but it also leaves you deeply uncomfortable and disturbed. I know the werewolf is the main figure here, but I find the way the bath messages consume you way creepier, even though they mean well. It's such a well-crafted nightmare sequence that you can only understand once you explore the story of the game, and that's what makes this kind of Gothic atmospheric horror so great. Yes, the images are disturbing, but there's actual story and meaning behind them. There's a message behind the blood, instead of it being there for simple shock value. The rest of this area is fantastically atmospheric. I love the lighting and the framing of the werewolf, and this moment is particularly significant because it's one of the rare times that you're almost entirely helpless. And on that word, helpless, it's a staple of horror games to give you limited means of defending yourself or none at all. For example, Resident Evil Classics or Outlast. I myself am not a huge fan of the latter genre because I find it much more impressive when a game creates a scary atmosphere whilst still giving you some means of defense. Bloodborne, in that regard, is profoundly impressive because you are rarely ever without defense. You're a hunter, after all, yet the game is still able to create this blanket of dread which it lays over every part of itself, partially because of the perfectly crafted visual design. Let's continue with a broad look at the city itself. It's an absolutely gorgeous Gothic set piece with narrow cobble streets, ornate railings, and looming statues. A huge reason why this genre of horror is so visually appealing is that mix between dread and beauty it presents. There's something very unnerving about these towering buildings with sharpened corners, these statues that seem present on every street, watching you. The architecture is dark and threatening. It's its own character, just as much a threat as the enemies in its cobble streets. Yet, it's still beautiful to look at, you still want to see more. Bloodborne absolutely perfects this aspect of the Gothic. It creates a dually dreadful and beautiful city you want to cower from, and see more of. It creates an atmosphere, and that, in my opinion, is the most important part of horror. Cathedral Ward is a straightforward continuation of Central Yharnam, but from there, the city begins to devolve, just as the game seems to break apart to reveal that it isn't only interested in the Gothic. I think Old Yharnam is just as effective as the Upper Cathedral Ward in some places. It's like you're walking through a burning graveyard, and the knowledge that Jura gives you reframes the entire game. The revelation that Bloodborne is about much, much more than running around and killing beasts in an unnerving gothic setting is so interesting to contend with, though I'm sure most players will avoid thinking about it to instead run from Jura's bullets. Later in the level, this section where you come across a congregation of beasts engaged in prayer is perfectly designed. In the middle of this hall stands a horrifying-looking creature crudely crucified in front of a crowd of what you thought was simply prey to be put down. Not only is the crowd of enemies intimidating to approach in general, but the atmosphere here is utterly perfect and disturbs me every time I'm passing through. Another aspect of aesthetic design worth bringing up here is sound design, because it is so good here. That sound is viscerally unnerving to me. Yes, I'm a hunter and I have the tools to take care of this situation, but this place is undeniably scary and I absolutely adore it. Moving on, the Forbidden Woods is a crossroads between the beastly certainties of Yharnam and the eldritch revelations that you find in Byrgenwerth. Thus, as a crossroads, it feels gothically dreamlike, especially once you wander into the snake section. It is absolutely lurid. There's strange lighting, and these snake men certainly push the bounds of what we, at this point in a playthrough, think beasthood is. I'm not a huge fan of this level overall, but I do appreciate the unnerving dream qualities it possesses. It makes you feel that you're delving further into a devolving nightmare, moving from a crumbling city into its infected backyard. I do, however, have a lot more love for Yargul. It's a reflection of Yharnam, this time embodying the Lovecraftian instead of the Gothic. It's deeply unnerving in a distinctly different way to the towering spires of Yharnam. It's fleshy and profoundly inhuman, as are all the inhabitants. A useful tool horror tends to employ is contrast, especially Lovecraftian horror. You're shown the normal, the typical, the everyday goings-on. Take Into the Mouth of Madness, for example. We're shown the everyday goings-on of our protagonist and the city of New York before descending into the horrific eldritch contrast of Hobbs End. In Bloodborne, though, contrast is used so interestingly because instead of a normal everyday picture, we're instead presented with a different form of horror, that being Gothic, and having that be contrasted with the Lovecraftian truth that Yargul introduces. And somehow, it's deeply effective. Fighting your way through Yharnam, you're left thinking it can't get worse than this situation, surely. But somehow it does. The situation devolves into something unknowable, made of something between flesh and ideas. It's such an interesting execution of horror. Bloodborne captures both the essence of the Gothic and the Lovecraftian, then contrasts the two to further their impact. I also want to give some praise to the Hypogean Jail, or however you say that, which is my favourite part of Yargul. It's a secret contained section that you're whisked away to by the Snatchers, thus the area is already framed by dread and confusion. There's a dreamlike haze as you wake up, again blurring the lines of reality, making you wonder if you've woken up in some twisted part of the hunter's dream after death. This place is great for all the same reasons Yargul in general is great, but it also has its own soundtrack which adds so much to the area. You feel completely out of place and vulnerable. In a game where you're supposed to be a hunter, you feel utterly hunted. It's a very intimidating area with a dread-inducing soundtrack, and it excels at disturbing the player. I mentioned earlier that atmosphere is the most important part of horror, and I'll use the jail to emphasize that point. Think of the scariest game you've ever played, the one that stuck with you after you turned it off, or perhaps the scariest level in a game. I can assure you that whatever area you're thinking of didn't abuse jump scares and cheap tricks. It built an atmosphere. It made you dread every step forward. It made you feel vulnerable. That is what I mean by atmosphere. Effective horror that sticks with you will fill you with dread, even when nothing much is happening. When you're exploring the jail, because of how effectively it cultivates a thick and dreadful atmosphere through visual, sound, and framing, you are scared, even when nothing's happening. You're cautious and afraid of turning corners, and that's what fear is, not a fleeting rush of adrenaline from an unearned jump scare. I've talked about this a lot in my past content, but it's worth reiterating, because atmosphere is what makes horror. Let's also consider the hunter's dream itself. As I've been waffling on about, this game creates an unnerving atmosphere partially by making places feel dreamlike and lurid, making areas appear to exist on the brink of reality. There are multiple sections throughout the game that have you feeling as though you're stuck in a nightmare that keeps getting deeper and further from the waking world. The game begins with that exact framing. And the Hunter's Dream exemplifies this whole concept. The doll often mentions the waking world, but as you move through the game, you find yourself wondering what that really means. It touches on the existential, making you wonder if anything you do really matters, if this is one big dream, if everywhere you go is simply a deeper level of consciousness. I don't think the Hunter's Dream is terrifying, but it adds to the overall atmosphere and unsettles you the more you learn about the world. I actually think it's quite beautiful, but that beauty is quickly marred by the reality that this place is a prison for you, the doll, and Gurman. It's a pretty lie, another layer of lurid reality sewn together by a monster you can't begin to comprehend. I find the DLC to be excellently made and quite atmospheric, but none of the levels come close to the horror that Ludwig's lead-up and boss room provides. This place is pure nightmare fuel, and you know something horrific has to be on the other side of this corridor of corpses, which certainly gets proven true. I think it's a very effective use of gore and body horror, two factors I'll explain further later, but their usage is very interesting here because it's implemented into the level design, not just the enemy design. This nightmare is a melting pot of flesh and terror. It is really well done and still makes me uncomfortable to this day. I think it's the highlight of the DLC in terms of horror, though the fishing hamlet is still a creepy place, especially if you're versed in its Lovecraftian inspiration. The DLC in general is a fantastic meeting point for all the horror tools Bloodborne uses perfectly: dreamscapes, contrast, body horror, existentialism, etc. It creates a thick, nightmarish atmosphere that stays with you, especially due to its bittersweet ending reminding you of the fact that all of this horror has real meaning behind it. We've made it to the end of the level visuals, so it's time to talk about one of my favourite areas in gaming ever, Upper Cathedral Ward. I mentioned earlier that you're rarely helpless in Bloodborne, and though you're not exactly helpless here, it certainly feels like it. From the start, you're cautious of this place, because it's locked away. It's a secret you have to put real effort into finding. You're primed with the dread of what you might find behind these doors. Thus, before you even step inside, a perfectly unnerving sense of dread has been created. And once you're through those doors, those intimidating Yharnam towers are right beside you. You're moving alongside architectural giants, and so that dread is furthered by the sense that you are distinctly out of your depth. You're stepping into a tower of secrets guarded by the heights of the city, and the celestial children certainly don't make you feel at ease. But what I really want to talk about is the inside of this place, and one of the most iconic parts of the entire game. You're met with a long, daunting hallway once you're past the first brainsucker, all the while being overwhelmed with the horrifying ambience which I'll go into more in a moment. But once you're past that, the level opens up into this hall lit by a warm chandelier, and for a brief moment, it seems almost comforting. You're pulled into this grand gothic hall lit by warm colours, almost as though it were fit for a masquerade, but as soon as you take a step forward to investigate, it all comes crashing down and you remember what game you're playing. This is a moment I can't put enough emphasis on. In a game where you're given 1,000 means to slay a city of beasts, a game where, despite its atmosphere, you're typically confident in your ability to hunt, in this one moment, you're sent straight into fight or flight mode. And I know I sound oddly excited over something that may seem so small, but isn't it genuinely amazing that a game that hands you a weapon and turns you into a hunter of entire cities is still able to send you into a scared frenzy? It shows the absolute mastery behind this game, the perfect conceptual understanding of horror and how to effectively create fear. This moment uses your fear of the unknown to its advantage, throwing you into a panicked state when you thought you were safe but now have an army of beasts who seem familiar, but not exactly so, charging at you. I know it's a small change, but giving the werewolves blue eyes instead of the previously seen red is a very integral part of the scare. Because although you've seen werewolves before, there's something not quite right with these ones, and that's enough to trigger your fear of the unknown. It destroys the confidence you may have previously had when it comes to dealing with these enemies. And so, 9 times out of 10, you'll find yourself running from these guys, desperately looking for a lamp or some corner of safety, only to be met with more horror. Let's get back to the ambience I mentioned. I want to highlight this with its own paragraph because it adds so much to the area. The horror sting isn't overdoing itself or unnecessary, it's an amazingly unnerving addition. You feel completely out of place when you hear this. It's horrifying and absurdly dread-inducing. I don't think I could point out a more effective ambient horror track than this, and without it, the ward is not nearly as effective in cultivating the atmosphere it does. I also want to note, in case you don't know, that this part of the OST is called Soothing Hymn. Perhaps it was once sung by the choir in order to soothe Abritus, or the children who once lived here. We don't know for sure, but that name, alongside the fact this place was an orphanage, is another effective use of contrast that enhances the unnerving atmosphere. I also want to go over the window jump scare because I think it's an excellent use of a jump scare, and that's a hard thing to come by. As I've discussed in past horror videos, jump scares have to be earned by a dread-inducing atmosphere. A jump scare thrown at you out of nowhere will make you jump, but it won't scare you, it won't stay with you, in fact, it'll leave you annoyed. But here, as I've outlined, Bloodborne creates a perfect atmosphere within the ward. Through a meticulous combination of the visuals and the sounds, this place thoroughly unnerves you, and thus the jump scare is earned. It doesn't feel cheap or out of place, it feels thrilling and perfectly placed, and that's what a jump scare should feel like. We've made it to the end of our discussion of level visuals. Before we move on to the enemy and boss visuals though, I want to remind you all to subscribe, like, and leave a comment if there's anything you have to add. I worked pretty hard to get this video out before the end of the year, so I do hope you're all enjoying, and if you are, do consider supporting me over on Ko-fi to help me out. Thank you for whatever you choose to do, and let's get back to the video. Let's take some time to appreciate the designs of enemies and bosses, and how they add to the atmosphere of the game. This will be a smaller section wherein I cover my personal highlights, starting first with the mad ones who show up in Hemwick. I think these guys are the highlight of that entire area, which is kind of funny because you can completely miss them if you don't have enough insight. They have a terribly unnerving sound design which plays at each appearance. They're creepy to look at and scary to fight due to how erratic they move. Even when I know I can beat them with ease in New Game Plus, I find them terrifying thanks to the masterful combination of sound and visuals. I think the fact that Bloodborne is able to keep you scared of some things even when you have the means to get rid of them shows how well it executes its horror. It does so absolutely perfectly. Another one of my absolute favourites are the slime scholars. They're kind of serving that analog horror humanoid look, but actually done effectively and with purpose. I think they get most of their creep factor from their uncanniness. You can immediately tell that these things were once human, and because of that, whatever happened to them could perhaps happen to you. The way they look, the way they move, it creates a very unnerving enemy I tend to avoid as much as possible during playthroughs. A pretty obvious choice for effective horror design is the research hall patients. They're scary for a similar reason the scholars are. They're uncanny and you fear you could have met the same fate as them, though like the mad ones, their frantic movements make them extra intimidating. Let's properly explain the game's use of body horror, as I've yet to put emphasis on it. Body horror is used often in Lovecraftian horror, though there's certainly uses of it in the Gothic too, as we see with Frankenstein's monster and the descriptions of Dracula's unnatural movements. Bloodborne makes use of both genres when it comes to body horror, as beasts and bestial transformation are a supernatural form of body horror as seen in the Gothic, whilst enemies like brainsuckers and living failures are more Lovecraftian body horror. I think the research hall patients are a mix of the two, as they reflect those supernatural science themes from Gothic horror and the search for eldritch truth which is, of course, Lovecraftian. But regardless of which category each enemy fits into, the point is that Bloodborne executes body horror brilliantly. The vast majority of what we fight was once human, and knowing our bodies could be twisted in the same way is the essence of body horror. As we see from the outstretched claw at the start of the game, or the ending wherein we are reduced to a writhing worm, such a fate is entirely possible. And that, most certainly, adds to the dread this game produces. Also noteworthy are the cramped caskets, the Loran silver beasts, and the snatchers. One of the main tells as to whether a horror design is effective is whether or not you want to run from it, especially in a game like this where you can fight back effectively. And in genuinely every playthrough I will avoid fighting all three of these guys every single time. The caskets are horrific to look at and definitely play into body horror. The silver beasts are disturbing mainly because they lure you in with a false sense of security, making you think they're just another average beast enemy. And the snatchers are simple yet so effective. They're scary due to the fear of the unknown they trigger, because they appear in already explored areas after you've killed the blood-starved beast. It's horrifying coming across one in an area you thought you knew, even more so when you realise that these guys are very tough to fight early game. And of course, their connection to the jail adds to their appearance. I wasn't quite sure where to place this next one, but I had to include it, so here seems a fine place. I think the Brain of Mensis and the void it exists in is absolutely phenomenal horror execution. It is flawless and terrifying. The fear of the dark is an extension of the fear of the unknown. You don't know what could be lurking in the shadows outside your window, or in the corner of your room, or down that darkened alleyway. It's primal. To be shown this deep void of shadow, a maw of darkness completely unlike anything else in the game, is horrifying. It's an extremely intimidating set piece, and it makes you dread every step forward, even as a hunter who's come as far as you have. And once you finally come across the brain, it's not exactly a jump scare, but it works in a similar way. Nothing is jumping out at you. In fact, this being is completely immobile and harmless, but its sudden appearance in the sea of emptiness is scary and will catch you off guard. The design itself is Lovecraftian excellence. This creature is a disgusting mass of wet flesh, yet its eyes follow you, and thus you know it has more to say. I love that we can commune with it. It's such a disturbing enemy, yet it does us no harm, at least when it's down here. In fact, it teaches us something. It is a perfect horror creation placed within a perfect horror set piece that uses contrast to its fullest capability. The last enemy I want to highlight is one of the greatest horror designs I've ever seen, the Winter Lanterns. These guys are genuine nightmare fuel, and one of the biggest reasons why is because they are used sparingly. In horror, if the threat is constantly thrown in your face, if it appears often in jump scares, then it'll become way less effective because you adjust to its presence. There's certainly ways to use that against the player, but typically it's better if a horror game doesn't overplay its hand. And the Winter Lanterns are perfectly played in my opinion. They're a rare enemy that doesn't show up until late game, and they're typically prowling an area alone. Their song is so well made, it fills me with indescribable dread every time I hear it. It is so impressive to me that game I've been playing for years is still able to unnerve me with an enemy I've killed countless times. But it does, and that's a testament to how perfect the horror is in this game. Of course, there's an area in Mensis where there's a few of them prowling about, but I think that's a well done horror section. It's not as atmospheric or unnerving as the previous areas I've mentioned, it's more action horror than anything because you'll find yourself trying to juggle frenzy build-up and dodging. It's still a scary section, but scary in a different way, and there aren't a huge amount of lanterns here, so I don't think they're overplayed even within the section. So the Winter Lanterns are scary because they aren't overplayed, and they're a real threat due to their frenzy build-up. But they're also scary because their design is absolutely horrifying, even more so when you realise they actually have the body of the doll. It adds an extra layer of disturb to their appearance, but of course the pulsing tentacled head made of eyes is pretty disturbing too. And as I mentioned, the song is extremely unnerving. It's masterfully made and it all comes together to create an absolutely perfect horror design. With the regular enemies covered, it's time to move on to our final visuals subsection, which will be even shorter, the bosses. I think all of the bosses are well designed, but a large amount of them are not exactly scary, and that's fine because there are some super unnerving highlights that we'll go over now. In terms of absolutely horrifying designs, we have the Blood-Starved Beast, the One Reborn, and Ludwig. They're gross and visceral and very effective at making you unwilling to come near because you're not quite sure what you're looking at, but you know you don't like it. They're very gory designs, and whilst I don't often like gore in horror, I think it has a place if it isn't overdone and used solely for shock value, which it sadly often is. You are primed to be absolutely terrified of Ludwig, as we discussed earlier. His arena and the lead up to it is a sea of undying, writhing corpses, threatening you with the same fate. And his design itself is absolute body horror perfection, alongside unnerving sound design blurring the lines of human and beast. I think he's one of the most iconic bosses in horror gaming. He blends the eldritch and the bestial, he's gothic commentary on the nature of humanity and our enduring spirit. He's horrifying, and I absolutely adore him. I don't think the designs of the Great Ones are scary, but they are deeply unnerving and add to the atmosphere of the game. They're a more quiet horror than the Blood-Starved Beast, but they're also beautiful in their own way, which was definitely done on purpose. We explored the Lovecraftian use of contrast earlier, with there being a contrast between the waking world and the eldritch horrors, but there also tends to be a contrast between allure and mind-breaking terror when it comes to the eldritch monsters themselves. There's always the madmen who find beauty in the beyond, always the characters who seem to be entranced by the great beast who drives everyone else mad. And that concept is clearly present within this game. Take Abritas, for example. She's visceral and unnerving, but also beautiful in a strange, unnameable way. I think the same goes for all the Great Ones we meet. They're unnerving, but you find yourself unable to look away. Just look at how Flora is presented to us. She's this grand, unsettling creature, yet your character finds it impossible, to look away. So that's the end of our visuals and aesthetics section, and the end of the video. I hope that I've outlined effectively the ways in which Bloodborne excels at horror through its visuals, and how it makes use of various horror techniques to create a profoundly unnerving atmosphere. Bloodborne's horror is not typically in your face and adrenaline-inducing, instead it's subtle and atmospheric. It's excellent in every way, and everyone on the development team had a very clear understanding of both Gothic and Lovecraftian genres. Thank you all for making it to the end of this one. I hope it pleases any of you who were hoping for more content focused on horror. This will be my last video of 2025, so thank you all for an amazing year on the platform. It's been such an experience so far, and I'm very interested to see where the channel goes next year. Though that is all for today, so remember to subscribe, join the Discord, support me on Ko-fi if you'd like, and enjoy your holidays.